game is to get into a discipline and a regimen about how much time you're going to invest every week in making it happen. I know, Mark, you've claimed this a full-time job to do your work, right? And you've shared that with us. And I know there's combinations of things in between in terms of your availability of time to invest to do this, but bottom line, it takes some real commitment and discipline about setting your own schedule for what you want to do on what day and how often do you want to do it and how much do you repeat and keep going.
Yeah.
So, but that kind of discipline does prevail. That's the good news.
And I always insist, fail in love with a deal after you sign and once you have the key of the business in your hands, not before.
Yeah.
Okay.
Alec, you have a question, sir?
Hey, Doug, it's good to hear from you. I haven't been on these as frequently as when Rich was hosting, so I apologize. But I actually wanted to hop back on this one. Kind of what you were saying, falling in love with that first deal that you kind of really get into the weeds with. I had my first one fall off. I looked at other prospects and have been over the past couple months. He's come back around actually from a conversation point. And I thought this would be kind of good for the group because I'm at this juncture right now where our last email correspondence is really him talking about, I'll even pull it up a little bit so I can kind of read it. He was talking about concerns essentially with the management handoff and like definitely some experience associated with there, right? Like he doesn't want to see his baby die as he hands it off. He wants to make sure he can get paid out. He wants to make sure he can pay all the stakeholders. And I know on other calls like this, we had kind of prefaced how to pitch our partnership with Acquira from an operational standpoint, obviously not pitching it as like some sort of private equity stake or anything, not coming across as like VCs or anything like that. But maybe as like a refresher for myself and the rest of the group, I'm typing up the email as we speak, kind of say, hey, since you do have some concerns about like the broader team and the management team, here's kind of something, here's a little nugget, because I haven't brought up to this particular seller that I'm working with Acquira yet at this point. So I didn't know if you had anything like to supplement with that.
Great question. And part of your story there is a great segue for our topic today, and we'll get into that in a moment. But to answer the second half of your statement there, yes, the thing we talk about at Acquira for successful transition is our ACE framework program. Now that is a separate program. There is a separate fee involved, but with ACE, you get a team of business advisors and specialists from Acquira deployed with you to make the transition. And without going into all the details, essentially ACE is designed as about a 6-month commitment, 6-month engagement. There is a notion of a 30-day pre-close deployment. You would start working with a lead integrator to basically plan your transition. We have additional training that's online, just like your Accelerator content is. We have ACE content in a program that's available online. It becomes kind of your playbook for the transition. But included in the program is your lead integrator, who serves kind of as a general coordinator and project manager of the transition with you. And then we have a people and culture specialist, a finance specialist, and a sales and marketing specialist that will be available to work with you and your team as you go through. The ultimate goal that we advocate in ACE is the notion of you transitioning into a management-run company. If the seller had any leaning toward owner-centric, you want to break out of that mold. You want to identify some key people in the company that can become part of a management team and you quickly move to delegating authority and control to them to operate on a day-to-day basis, so that you are more focused on the strategic elements of the business, new ideas, growth ideas, expansions, etc., and you're not bogged down in the day-to-day. Now, just to qualify that, we are very much bullish on the idea when you take over the business, you need to be there right on day one, and you need to be deep in the weeds, probably for at least the first 30 days, if not longer, so that you've really successfully gotten the download from the owner or seller. Part of that early stage transition is a very intentional succession plan from the seller to basically get them to dump their brain out on the table and give you everything that they've accumulated over the years. So that is a very direct and intense relationship there. But eventually you allow that seller to go away. Bye-bye. Thank you. Good deal. Goodbye. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. But at that point, you start making the pivot to rely on your management team to pick up and run the bulk of the day-to-day operation. So, Alec, does that make sense for you?
No, absolutely. That definitely answers his management concerns. More so how to pitch it. I could definitely take some of the points there without directly naming the ACE framework and kind of tee it up in that capacity, and then also give him some support with what the paperwork and security vehicles look like, of course, associated with the transaction, is really what he's looking for in the email. And I saw this was going to pop up, and I was like, this is perfect timing for the email today. So thank you, Doug.
Great. Mark, I think you had your hand up. We kind of blew past. Are you good?
Yeah, I was going to pick up actually where Alec had left off there. I think it was a great point about the shape of deals changes over time. In the last 3 to 5 months, I've seen deals that were promising collapse and then pull themselves up again over time. I think one of the things that I'm picking up is that I often say you're not trying to solve a puzzle with this process, you're trying to solve a mystery. And sometimes you have to provide additional concepts, ideas, thoughts to make the deal shape. I think this is a very emotional process for everybody involved. Sellers want to get paid, brokers want to get paid, we want a business. And so it's important to look for value, which, take just different forms for different people, and understanding that. I do think that also, when you talk about what I'm learning, over all these deals I'm looking at, working capital is a black box. Sellers don't get it. They think the cash and AR is theirs, and what do you want it for? But you get the key day one, and you've got bills, right? And so trying to get them to understand that concept is definitely proving to be a challenge. I think the broker quality is highly variable. Some just do SDE times some random factor. Others have deep knowledge and skills. When you're selling HVAC, electric, candy shops, and Domino's Pizza, it's hard to be an expert in all those areas. So a lot of times they're just sort of coming to the table with basic knowledge. I've seen valuations drop by 1 to 2 million once you start poking at the financials, and you can get them across that as well. The last thing that I'm picking up on is that we're already CEOs. We're already managing, people who don't, necessarily report to us, but they're part of our team. My brokers are part of my team. My bankers are part of my team. My attorneys are part of my team. I have to manage the environment and make sure that communication is flowing the right way, right direction. People are on task. So whether you have a business or not, the fact that you're here, you're already a CEO.
That's a very good point, Mark, and I appreciate you saying that and sharing that. That is so very true. On the broker statement, let me throw this out. I probably need to apologize in advance for what I'm getting ready to say. I'll double down on what Mark said. I think the broker spectrum is wide, the variability of it. And I want to focus on the brokers on the positive end, the guys that really do a good job and really help vet things and truly provide a service. The analogy that I have drawn, I come from a banking career, and much of my banking was in real estate related. A lot of it was in mortgage finance. And what I knew there early on is that among the whole world of real estate brokerage, and if any of you hold a real estate broker license, and no personal slam meant here, but the statistics tell us that only about 10% of the real estate brokers ever make any money being a real estate broker. The other 90% struggle with it. They paid their fee, they got their license, but they don't know how to turn it into a business, or they're not associated with someone that can help them turn it into a real viable business. And I am quickly moving, I'm not quite there yet, but I'm quickly moving to the notion that I think in the business broker world, we're not far off of that metric. I think about 10% of them are really productive, really solid, really service providers. They get the game, they understand, they are there for a greater good, not just the commission check. And they're wonderful to work with. We've got a pleasure in certain markets to have identified some of those players that fit that category. The vast majority of everybody else, they're spaghetti slingers. They throw stuff on the wall to see if it'll stick, and if they can get their check and that they're happy, and end of deal, move on. So to Mark's point, you do have to be careful. And if you start sensing you're dealing with one of those lesser brokers, you need to drive the train as best you can, to Mark's point of being CEO of your own enterprise. And some of them are going to be gatekeepers, are going to make it hard rather than easy to get through and get deals done. But at that same point, I want to go all the way back to one of the early statements Alec made. Sometimes when you meet a seller and meet their broker, the deal may fall through initially, but if you've done the best you can do to build rapport, build respect, build kind of a mutual positivity about the deal, if it does fall apart, you might well be on the short list for callback. If whatever alternative they thought they had to you falls through, if you did your work well in being professional, but also being graceful and respectful of everything, you likely will get that call back. And they will say, we're willing to talk again. Things have changed, our situation has changed. And we've had that happen to our AEs a number of times. The deal fell through, thought it was over, moved on to something else, and then 30, 60, 90 days get a call back, say, surprise, we're back. What do you think? And that can happen. So I think that may be a good segue into the first sort of segment here I'd like to do. And I kind of teased it in the email. I want to talk a little bit about the seller psychology. I want to try to, for a little bit of time here today, put ourselves in the seller's shoes for a minute and think about what we would have to do to become a good target buyer of a business when the seller has 1,000 things going on in their head about this life-changing transition. And in the spectrum of seller possibilities, what we have seen at Acquira, again, on the high side, we've got some sellers that are highly motivated. They've made a serious commitment to a life change, a life choice, to move away from the business. They want to get it done. Case story in point, we had a seller who went through the inevitable life chapter of having his mother become ill and pass away. And as the story goes, on her deathbed, she told him, sell the damn business, go live your life. You've worked hard, you've earned it. You know, if you get a fair price for it, you'll be set and you'll be good. And don't drag this out any longer. And he obeyed his mama and put his business up for sale fundamentally the next day. And was an incredibly proactive seller. When he was asked about data and information, it wasn't days, it was hours that the answer would be provided. And he was just an exceptional uh, partner to work with to get that business sold. And the transition was as friendly as it could be. It was as direct and positive as it could be. But he was motivated to get the heck out of there, to follow his mama's instruction, and he did it. On the other end, we have sellers who think they want to sell, and as things start coming together and money is being spent to commission attorneys to draw documents, the sellers get the documents. When they finally see the reality, here's the written page that's going to take this business away from me, they have a panic attack. They have a kind of a meltdown of like, I don't think I can do that. This is who I am. This is what I do. And thankfully, those don't happen often, but my point is they do happen. And then you've got the other situation where the seller gets all the way through closing, but they make it really difficult for the transition. They just can't quite release the grip. And that becomes a real potential problem if you've taken ownership and that seller is still finding ways to meddle in the business above and beyond helping you make the transition. So being sensitive and aware of that spectrum of possibility of where your seller is going to be when you talk to them, I would argue one of the best remedies for that is to start early, trying to discern where is the seller's head? What camp are they in? Are they truly genuinely ready to go? And we talked to a seller a couple of weeks ago. They're fundamentally burned out. They've run a good business, but they've done it for something like 30 years, and they're just burned out. They can't even think about taking a new step to a new initiative and expanding or adding a new product or something like that. That's the last thing they would ever want to do. But they're ready and they're willing. So you can run into those situations. So a couple of so that's the first remedy, is to begin your process early in building rapport with that seller, to really sympathize and empathize with what they've had. And Alec, you use the phrase, they're handing off their baby. Absolutely. I agree 100% with that concept. They've worked hard, they built this thing, and they've invested in the people that are there. And there is a connection. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the word family coming out of the seller's mouth. These people are my family. They've worked hard for me and my families, therefore I count them as family. And now we're going to break up the family. That doesn't feel good. So they're concerned. They want assurance that those people are not going to be handled poorly. So those kind of discussions are very real, and they're very pertinent to the success of these deals. We can often see situations where the seller's mind starts to shift a little bit. Maybe you picked up it was positive. Now they're starting to get closer into the reality of the transition that's coming. Now they turn a little more negative and a little more difficult to work with. I'm going to tell you 99% of the time, it's not you, it's them. So, but you need to put on a little bit of a psychologist hat and say, what changed? What's going on here? What's possible? Gloria, you have a question?
Yes, talking about sellers, how frequently is it, you know that this has happened to me more than once, that the sellers don't want us to talk with the employees? How do you manage that? How do you do that? How common is that? I'm the only one who is finding that, or?
No, I appreciate you bringing that up, Gloria, and that's a good next point here. What Gloria is talking about in our training material, and we talk about this a lot. We at Acquira are big advocates of the need for you as a potential buyer to have some opportunity before closing to meet with, at a minimum, you meet with the key individuals in the business other than the seller. If they tell you they've got an office manager or a GM or a crew chief or a lead technician, you need to be able to try to meet those people to really see a little deeper truth about how the business is positioned. One of my colleagues used to describe it as, back to residential real estate, who would ever consider buying a house without doing a walkthrough of it? Anybody? Anybody ever had to do that? I mean, I realize there's some scenarios you might have to do it that way, but generally, no. You would never agree to go to a closing office and sign on a house you never walked through. And so that's a similar challenge here in respect to, you go into the deal, you're talking to the broker and the seller, and that's all you hear about the business. You hear their version of it. You see their data sheets, financials, etc. Maybe some pictures of what the business looks like on a drive-by, but you don't get to see any of the people. You don't get to see any of the facility. And the best way, and I knew you were probably going to ask this, Gloria, so I've been thinking about it, getting ready for today. I would suggest that the best way to start that process is not let that request be a surprise to the seller. Start talking early. As you start building rapport with the seller and even the broker, because maybe the broker will in fact be a champion for you to help persuade the seller. When you talk to both of them, plant the seed early that somewhere in this journey, you're going to ask for that opportunity to meet some people, see the property, and do an on-site. And we have had a lot of scenarios posed, and we've had a lot of discussion about the message during that visit. One theory is to show up and let the seller say, this person is a potential investor in our business, but not say I'm selling. The longer I've thought about that, I personally don't like that story because it's already a fabrication of what's happening. Yes, you're an investor, but you're investing for yourself and you want to buy the business. That's the point of the investment. So I do think it's a potential tripwire for the seller to not want to divulge that the sale is pending. But the more of these deals that I watch and that I'm a little bit of a part of, the conclusion I'm drawing, just to be really blunt about it, if a seller has that kind of anxiety about what they're getting ready to do, to me, that becomes a red flag. They have not built a culture of trust with the people that work for them, to put it bluntly. If they're that afraid of telling them, I'm thinking about selling, and they fear that it's going to blow up, everybody's going to run away, everybody's going to quit, nobody's going to hang around for the rest of the story, that really, I think, speaks to a gap in the success that seller has had building trust with their team. we just had, Dana, I might let you explain more of this. We just had a scenario where our AE asked for an on-site and the seller pretty much opened the whole kimono, right?
That is correct.
So why don't you describe that scenario real quick?
Sure. We've got an AE that is in deep discussions with a seller, and was actually invited to come meet the group, the executive group at the company. And not only was he invited, he asked if I could come along. And you know, Doug, I wanted to make an additional comment that relates to Alex's first question. Not only do sellers like hearing, because of this whole family topic that Doug was talking about, when we first meet the team, of course, the AE is going to talk to the team. They're going to, say, here's who I am, here's what my vision is, this is what I plan on doing, and this is why I think it'll be good for you. And by the way, here's Dana over here, who is with Acquira, and I'm essentially in the role of a mentor. So, and it's not just me. I mean, it's me, it's Doug, and other individuals within Acquira and our networks that we can access if as needed. But in going back to this particular company, the seller was the most highly motivated seller I've ever seen because of a health issue that came up that he is very serious about, and wants to go faster than the buyer can actually go. I mean, he's wanting to go very fast. So he invited us up, and we got a chance to talk to all of the key leadership employees in the company. They loved the story. The seller has actually been holding them back because of his health issues, he didn't want to take on more than what he thought he would be able to handle. So he's been pulling back on the reins for this group of racehorses he's got. And the buyer is, as soon as that buyer closes, they have a number of initiatives that they plan on taking off with. And I have no doubt that given 2 years and they're going to at least double their revenue and possibly more. It is an absolute amazing situation that is totally the opposite of a couple others we had. That the sellers did not want to disclose to anyone. And in those cases, you mind if I mention those, Doug, and how we handled those? In both of the cases I'm thinking about, we had sellers who did not want to talk. And in fact, even, at closing, they were willing to make the introductions and everything. But what we found was that the management team, in 2 out of 3 of those, the management team were highly capable. And they were looking for a different style of management that would empower them. They had been running all of these companies. They had essentially been running the vast majority of the operations of the company. They knew everything from A to Z, and they were all committed to it all long term. But the sellers were so controlling and in a couple of cases so abusive that these employees were on the fence, in some cases on the fence about quitting. And when they heard the story from the AE, they just fell in love with the AE. I mean, it was like, this is my dream come true. I didn't think this would happen. And they've all of a sudden graduated, if you will, into a completely different ownership arrangement where we assured them that the approach was growth, opportunity, reward, growth, opportunity, reward, rinse and repeat. That's kind of the approach that these guys are taking, and it's being well received in 2 out of 3 of those companies. So it sort of covers the gamut of the seller reactions you might have.
Right. Yeah, in that more owner-dominated environment, I have seen this happen for decades. Really, I tell the story. I go back to my early banking days, watching companies start up and grow up, and potentially hit invisible walls where the growth of the business was exceeding the capacity of the owner and the owner's willingness to kind of let go and delegate and let others, run free. And it's not uncommon at all to see what Dana's describing, is that if you as a new owner show up and say, hey guys, I picked this business because I believe in what you've already done. And I think there's great potential in what we can do together. And part of my strategy is that I am looking for something that's already well established and an opportunity to grow and expand. And all you got to do is, drop the nugget and the invitation to give me your ideas. And you might have just opened a floodgate of good stuff that you're going to be able to filter through and work with. Mark, you've got a thought? Oh, you're on mute still.
I'll press some button. I love the arc of this conversation. I think, and I've seen I've had certain actual sellers own up to being micromanagers. And I think, situationally, micromanagement is good in certain parts of the business, like startup. Knowing where everything is, every corner, every cranny is a thing of value. But to grow up, you're going to have to learn how to lead. And I think that, for me, again, we all have a psychology or, an emotional part of this. I'm not really interested in the business where the seller's not trying to preserve or enhance a legacy. If this has been a transactional thing where, you're just, these are my worker bees and doing this, that, and the third in the marketplace, that tells you something about the culture. And when you're buying a business, you're not just buying plant, equipment, customer lists, markets. You're buying talent, you're buying culture. And so you could walk into a lot of things you need to fix. From a corporate perspective, looking at M&A over 20 years, culture was usually the last thing considered at M&A. And the one thing that crushes the synergy of two companies coming together, where the cultures don't match. So I think there's, not to be an arrogant buyer, we want to look at deals, but be a little discerning about whether or not the leadership or the owner has established a culture that you're going to be able to enhance and grow. And the last thing about the site visits, we're not the only ones who need to see the site. If this is a business that's a thing of value in the marketplace and there's multiple offers or whatever, many others need to have a site visit too. So it's incumbent on a seller to have a story or an approach to that, so you don't build negative will with the employees when people come through. I just went on a site visit last week, and they just said, hey, this is someone we just do site tours. They didn't give me a name, an investor or a customer. I'm just doing a site tour, and they've done several and doing several more. And I think that they're comfortable with bringing people in their plant, so that they can have a good sort of look-see at the business that they're offering. So, just good conversation overall.
Well, you can extrapolate this and you could potentially point fingers to the broker again and say, well, the broker ought to be an advocate for the site visit because, they ought to appreciate the need for a potential buyer to do that. But I'm saying I don't want to camp out on that alone. I don't want to create a convenient excuse for why you can't get a site visit done. But my point is, I think it's what I would recommend for your first line of defense as a potential buyer. Once you build the initial rapport with the seller, you got to do that first. You got to kind of get through this know, like, and trust dynamic to where there's a little bit of trust that's starting to develop and the seller is curious and intrigued by who you are and what you're going to offer. Then you can start planting these seeds of what you're going to need. You're going to need cooperation and due diligence. You're going to need to be able to get information in a deeper dive. You're going to need to do a site visit. You're going to need to have discussions. And, all of those early seeds that you plant with them, then none of that becomes a surprise at a later date. And if I've seen anything that might be a risk in a project plan, I think there is a temptation to really dive deep in the numbers. You know, you get your LOI approved and countersigned. Now you immediately turn to the numbers and you want to start your quality of earnings assessment, which is right. You need to do that. But what I'm saying is it's not numbers alone. In parallel, you ought to be having these other discussions about, you know, now we get into operational due diligence. All right, let's start with, tell me who your team is. Who do you have on, you know, on your roster? What's their tenure? What's their skill set? All of those kinds of questions. And if a seller balks at providing any of that kind of data, then again, you start accumulating red flags that say, maybe this deal is not for me, you know. And the sooner you can determine those things, number one, the less money you're going to spend working through the due diligence and everything. If you can't get good answers to a lot of these questions, I wouldn't even commission a QOE. Don't even spend that money. Just if you can't get as an example, if you can't get a reasonably comprehensive set of financial data from the seller, the broker should have alerted them that there's going to be a deeper dive in financials, will be the next step after the LOI. And if that's not ready to go and it takes them 6 months to produce that, it's like, seriously, are you really committed to selling this business? You haven't even been able to provide that for us. So there are some kind of logical progressions here of things to ask for first, so that you're not spending a lot of your capital engaging services that are not going to be fulfilled, not because the vendor can't do it, but because the seller can't do it. So, you know, be on the watch for that. Let me take a quick pause and ask any other thoughts or questions along this line from anybody else? No?
Doug, I would just echo what Mark was saying about culture versus, and what you were saying about culture versus numbers, because I see a lot of the numbers and I understand them, but if something's going to blow up, it's generally not the numbers. It's the culture and the people. You know, at least that's been my experience so far here, and that is it can be a real. You can have numbers on a piece of paper that seem like they really work, but if the culture isn't right, or you don't think you can manage that culture to a better position in a better place, and they're not ready for it, then it can be a real hard time for the new AE. So that was a good point.
Very good. Yeah. So I've got one last kind of maybe the back end bookend on this discussion about seller psychology. So I think the last critical element of the whole seller journey is being sure that you have talked with the seller and you get papered into the closing a seller transition agreement. And maybe different attorneys call it different things, but a seller services agreement or a transition agreement, that's separate from the purchase agreement. What that document does, it defines the role of the seller post-closing. And if you've negotiated with the seller something like, I'm going to need you to stay around full time for 3 months, and then we're going to pivot to a part-time for 3 more months, and then maybe an on-call only for 3 more after that, spell it out, put that in the agreement. And as any good agreement should have, you need to have a consideration for violation of the agreement. If something doesn't work the way we need it to, that there are some triggers in there and there are some considerations that get invoked. And if you go into a closing without a seller transition agreement, you're opening yourself up for all manner of conduct, and you have no particular legal basis other than to have to call the local cops and say, this guy's trespassing on my property. I want him out of here. And that, of course, gets real ugly and real messy for a lot of other reasons. But anything short of that, that's not going well, you don't have a basis if you don't have some kind of agreement that spells that out, that you can point to and map out. And it is a critical element to consider because, again, I go back to the seller psychology. It's hard to know exactly how the sellers are going to take the deal, once they get up from the closing table. And hopefully you do have a seller that is sincere about the love they have of the business and the people. They want to see it thrive and survive. And they're going to be friendly and cooperative and supportive of the transition. But in most of the deals we've done, even the best of the kumbaya kind of moments that we have, inevitably at about the 90-day mark, the sellers figures it out and they're ready to move on. It's like, not my deal anymore. I need to get out of here. I'm happy to leave, and I'll step away. And if even if your agreement says they need to be committed longer, if you've truly reached that part of harmony, you've gotten as much download as you can get from them, and they are in fact not serving a really good purpose anymore, let them go. Let them. You can easily sign a quick amendment to that original agreement that both parties say, we're done, we're fine, we're good, we're out of here. And that is a much more favorable and palatable scenario than having nothing in the way of an agreement on how the seller transition is going to work, other than a verbal and a handshake. And the verbal and a handshake, I would argue that as morally and ethically right that you would like to hope that could be, you cannot account for the ultimate psychology of what's going to kick in for the seller. So if you're not protected by some form of agreement at that point, you're going to be in a bind. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Couple of minutes left. I do want to shift gears. Mark, you kind of teased this one out. Let's talk about our old friend working capital. You summed it up well, Mark. Working capital tends to be a black box. I know a gentleman that's been in this M&A game for a very long time, and when I talk to him, he laments. He said, I don't know when working capital became a thing. He said there was a time in his career where working capital was not a factor in the legal stack or even the closing parameters. You agreed on a business, a price for the business, and the buyer needed to have cash in reserve somewhere that would cover the working capital demand. And that was just kept separate and apart. And unless it was a total asset sale, the notion that the seller had money in the business bank account that needed to be accounted for properly, traditionally back in this day, they got to take it with them. If there was 400,000 in the bank account, that was their money to take out of the business over and above whatever the agreed selling price was. So it was pretty cut and dried, pretty easy to work on, pretty easy to evaluate, and definitely nothing that anybody got crossways over. But somewhere, somehow along the way, and I don't know if it's our friends in the PE world or the VC world that overcomplicated it, but it's permeated down to Main Street M&A, which is what we're doing, now working capital is a consideration, and it is, to Mark's point, it's often a black box. People don't always get it. There are about 3 prevailing ways to calculate it, and not everybody agrees on the right way to calculate it. And if you divulge that you're using plan A to calculate working capital, you'll get people that'll argue with you and say, no, plan B is the only way to do working capital. And you'll have that discussion going on. But I think a couple of the critical elements that tend to be common in all of the methods of calculating working capital is cash. You know, how much cash is going to be left in the business. That's one factor. But then there's also receivables. You know, what is your timing of receivables and your reliability of receivables? And, you know, that can be a harder number to figure out and agree upon, but nonetheless, it's usually there. If even the most basic of financials have been prepared, you can identify that trend line on the receivables. The risk with relying on that is the idea that the business can be seasonal. So you might see a big bubble in receivables for half of the year, and then they trail off to near nothing for the other half of the year. And what assumption do you want to make about the availability of that being part of your working capital? And then thirdly, and this one also gets tricky and can be very complex, is the notion of work in progress, particularly for businesses where customers are paying deposits up front, like maybe half of the contract value up front. Contract begins, it's pre-close, that money goes into the seller's bank. You get halfway through the project, you do the closing on the business. Now you've got expenses associated with performing that work. Who gets credit? Who pays the expenses, and who gets credit for the revenue? All of that gets to be a delicate balancing act. Gloria and I worked on a deal together where it was a very interesting experience for me, because we got to the challenge of defining working capital, so that, I'm sorry, work in progress, so that we could paper that into the purchase agreement as a defined schedule. And the seller's attorney came up with one of the most amazing spreadsheets of how to calculate work in progress that I had ever seen. And I had said to Gloria, if you can get the seller to fill this out, you've got gold here. If this works for us, if the seller's going to take his attorney's advice and fill out this sheet for us, this will be amazing. Well, they did. They filled out the sheet, but the data we got in the sheet was just crap. I mean, and to give you an idea of the oddities in it, they had a project that was $300,000 with an estimated completion date of 6 months. Okay, probably that sounds maybe right. But then you go down a minute and there's another project that was $50,000, much smaller than the first one, and its completion date was like 9 months. And you're going, what? How does that work? And then you come back to a $400,000 one, and it was going to be 3 months. And it's like, wait, what are you doing? How does this work? And there was no good rhyme or reason to any of the data that was on that schedule. And as I recall, Gloria, the seller couldn't explain it. He just said, that's what it is. And he didn't really have a lot of, you might have gotten a lot more detail than I remembered, but.
Yes, they have this big spreadsheet. It was a PDF with not completion dates. And once we got the completion dates, and I took the time to put all that information in an Excel, and found a lot of information, not only the craziness about the size of the project, versus the time to complete it, but who was selling what.
Right. Right.
I'm finding out that basically the seller was selling everything and he didn't have a salesperson at that time.
Right. Right. So when you get into a work in progress, or the acronym is WIP, a WIP schedule, you're going to be dealing with that whole notion of what should the seller be entitled to hold on to as revenue earned versus work completed. And if you've got materials on order and the timing of the receipt of that and the billing and of the expenses for those, that's where your WIP schedules get very complex and very hard to look at and work through. But nonetheless, particularly on a project-oriented company, you've got to do that work with the WIP schedule and get the breakdown of that, because the last thing you want to do is inherit a bunch of contracts where all the revenue's already been banked, but there's a whole lot of expenses yet to come to complete the project. And those expenses come out of your cash. And if you don't have an offset on the revenue side, you're digging a hole really fast. Everybody follow me there? So there are ways to spread those with a spreadsheet that has that timeline of here's our projected close date. Everything before this goes this way, everything after that goes this way, and you get all that baked into your purchase agreement. And that can become an element in your working capital calculation to say, well, because I'm going to get 300,000 off my WIP schedule in cash for work pending, I'm going to be okay, plus anything else that I'm bringing in or putting in. So anyway, Dana, any other thoughts on that? Put you on the spot if you've got.
No, it's almost an individual company by company analysis where you have to really figure out. Different kinds of companies have different working capital requirements, and you've got different sellers that are doing different things. So it's you covered it. It was a great introduction, and the point is made. We need to pay attention to that really closely.
Yep. All right, everybody. I know we're about up on time. I want to respect everybody's time. Any last thoughts or questions real quick before we sign off?
Thanks for the information today, Doug.
Hearing none, I'll say goodbye, and thanks everybody. Hope to see you again next week.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Bye for now.
Have a good
Thank you all.
weekend.
Thanks, guys.